In the winter of 1954, nearly 1 million people packed their belongings, boarded ships and trucks, and fled south across a newly drawn line on a map. They left behind their homes, their land, and most of what they owned. What they could not leave behind, what they carried in their bodies, in their muscle memory, in the smell instinct, buried somewhere behind the eyes, was a bowl of soup. Historians point to ideology, fear of communist reprisals, and the pressure of Catholic clergy urging their congregations to move. But there is one cause that rarely makes the textbook: pho. Specifically, a single dish so embedded in the daily rhythms of northern Vietnamese life that its sudden absence in the south would reshape a city, ignite an industry, and change the way an entire nation understood itself. Today, you can order a bowl of it at a strip mall in Houston or a food court in Melbourne for under $15, and most people never think twice about it. So how did a pot of bones, herbs, and rice noodles go from the muddy riverbanks of colonial Vietnam to one of the most recognizable dishes on earth? And what did it cost the people who made it along the way? To understand pho, you have to start with biology. The human body is roughly 60% water, and holding that water in the right compartments at the right temperature with the right electrolyte balance is one of the most energy-expensive things your body does every hour of every day. Your gut needs collagen to maintain its lining. Your joints need it to reduce friction. Your skin needs it to hold its structure. Without adequate protein and mineral intake, the body begins to break down its own tissue, starting with the muscles, then moving inward. This is not a slow process. Severe protein deficiency can begin degrading organ function within weeks. And in a country where monsoons regularly destroyed harvests, where colonial taxation stripped subsistence farmers of their surpluses, and where war was not an occasional event but a near-permanent condition, a dish that delivered bone-extracted collagen, complete protein from meat, electrolytes from broth, and carbohydrates from noodles in a single affordable bowl was not a luxury. It was medicine. The connection between bone broth and healing runs deep enough that it crosses species. Wild wolves, after a kill, will often crack long bones and lap the marrow before eating the meat. Behavior that nutritional anthropologists now believe reflects an instinctive drive toward caloric density and fat-soluble nutrients unavailable in muscle alone. Humans watched, learned, and eventually built entire culinary traditions around the same principle. Boil the bones long enough, and they give you everything. Pho is that principle raised to an art form, and to understand how it got there, you have to go back much further than most people expect. Some of the earliest evidence of deliberate bone broth preparation in Southeast Asia comes from archaeological sites along the Red River Delta in what is now northern Vietnam, where ceramic cooking vessels dating to approximately 2000 BCE show charring patterns consistent with long, low-heat liquid cooking. That makes the technique underlying pho older than the Zhou dynasty of China, older than the Vedic civilization of India's Gangetic Plain, older, in other words, than almost every culinary tradition that claims pho's ancestry. A second site in what is now Yunnan province in southwestern China shows similar evidence of spiced broth preparation using star anise and cinnamon as flavor agents from roughly the same period. That makes this not a local quirk, but a regional pattern, a parallel development across two distinct cultures that independently arrived at the same conclusion: bones, water, heat, and time. These were not casual activities. They required dedicated pottery, controlled fires, access to spice trade networks that stretched hundreds of miles, and the kind of settled community life that comes with agriculture. The dish we eventually call pho is the product not of a single invention, but of 1,000 years of incremental technique accumulating along river valleys and trade corridors. Then the colonizers arrived. In the late 19th century, French colonial administrators established their headquarters in Hanoi, and with them came hundreds of thousands of French soldiers, engineers, and bureaucrats who brought a very specific dietary habit: beef. The Vietnamese had historically eaten pork and chicken, Water buffalo were work animals, too valuable to slaughter casually. But the French demanded beef, and the slaughterhouses that rose around Hanoi to supply them produced an enormous byproduct that Vietnamese workers were quick to recognize: bones. In the slaughterhouse neighborhoods north of Hanoi, in a district called Nam Dinh, street vendors began experimenting with what to do with them. They had the bones, they had the star anise and cinnamon from centuries of trade, they had the rice noodles that were already a staple, and they had the knowledge, older than any dynasty on earth, of what long-boiled bones could do. The French noticed nothing. The dish was beneath their attention, and that invisibility was about to become its greatest protection. By the early 20th century, the French colonial administration had constructed one of the most extractive economic systems in Asia. They did not merely tax the Vietnamese, they monopolized the three commodities most essential to daily life: salt, alcohol, and opium. The monopoly on salt alone was enforced by a network of inspectors empowered to search homes and impose penalties. A Vietnamese peasant farmer could not afford to season their food without channeling money directly to the colonial treasury. A government minister named Paul Dumas, who would later become president of France, argued explicitly that the monopoly system was more efficient than direct taxation because it was hidden inside the price of ordinary goods. Most people never saw the mechanism, they just knew that their daily necessities cost more than they should. And a bowl of pho, which required no salt monopoly approval, no alcohol license, no opium, became something quietly radical, a hot meal that belonged entirely to the people who made it. There is a word for this in Vietnamese: quan. A small roadside stall, often run from a single cart or a low table on the sidewalk, selling one dish early in the morning to workers on their way to labor that mostly benefited someone else. Pho became the quan food, and the quan system became one of the most sophisticated informal economies in colonial Southeast Asia. The French eventually became customers. There is documented evidence from the 1920s of French officers frequenting pho vendors in Hanoi, and one colonial-era guidebook described the broth as clear and delicate, with a depth that defies easy explanation. It defied easy explanation because it was the product of cooking knowledge the French had never seen: 24-hour simmers, spice combinations that had no European equivalent, the deliberate charring of ginger and onion over open flame before they entered the pot. The dish had no word in French, they had to borrow the Vietnamese one, and while the French were borrowing vocabulary, an entire generation of Vietnamese vendors was perfecting the recipe, building something that would prove far more durable than the empire trying to tax it. While Hanoi's pho culture was developing under French eyes that mostly refused to see it, another stream of influence was moving south and west through some of the most difficult terrain in Southeast Asia. The Mekong River system, stretching nearly 3,000 miles from the Tibetan Plateau, through Yunnan, Myanmar, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam, was the continent's great invisible highway, a corridor along which spices, animals, cultivation techniques, and culinary knowledge moved for millennia before any colonial power drew a line on a map. A single spice merchant traveling the river route from Yunnan to the Mekong Delta in the 1880s could carry 200 pounds of star anise, cinnamon bark, and cloves on a single river junk, selling portions at each delta port, arriving in the south with an empty boat and a full pocket. The journey took 3 weeks in good conditions. In monsoon season, it took a month, and sometimes people did not arrive at all. The great Vietnamese food writer Nguyen Tuan, writing in the 1940s, documented these river trade networks with the precision of a supply chain analyst, noting that the specific variety of star anise that defines northern pho, grown in the Guangxi region of China, just north of the Vietnamese border, was available only through a network of Hoa traders whose routes had been operating continuously since the 15th century. Not metaphorically continuously. Literally, the same families, the same routes, 500 years. By the 1920s, Hanoi had an established pho economy. Vendors competed not just on broth quality, but on the provenance of their spices, advertising the origin of their star anise the way a winemaker advertises terroir. A bowl from a vendor using Guangxi star anise was considered superior to one using the domestic Lang Sern variety, and customers who knew the difference paid accordingly. The man who first turned this street food into a restaurant dish, who moved pho from the sidewalk cart to the indoor table, was a vendor named Ko Ku in the Nam Dinh district, sometime around 1925. Historians of Vietnamese food debate this attribution vigorously. But the fact that anyone is debating it tells you something. By the 1920s, pho was already important enough to fight over its origin story. And it was about to become important enough to fight a war over. The First Indochina War, which began in 1946 after France refused to recognize Vietnamese independence, turned pho from a civilian comfort food into a military logistics problem. The Viet Minh forces, fighting the French in the Northern Highlands, faced a supply chain that had been disrupted by deliberate French targeting of civilian infrastructure, including the rice noodle factories and cattle markets that supplied the raw materials for pho production. In the Viet Bac mountain strongholds where Ho Chi Minh's government had retreated, the price of rice noodles quadrupled between 1947 and 1950. Before the war, a kilogram of ban pho, the flat rice noodles essential to the dish, cost roughly 2 dong. By 1950, in besieged highland areas, the same kilogram traded for 8 to 10 dong when it could be found at all. Soldiers documented in letters home the psychological weight of deprivation, not just of calories, but of the specific thing. One soldier, quoted in a post-war memoir collection, wrote to his mother, "I dream of pho the way I used to dream of beautiful women. When I wake up, I am twice as hungry and twice as lonely." Commanders understood this. Ho Chi Minh himself, in his writings about sustaining morale among fighters, specifically mentioned the importance of maintaining food traditions as a form of cultural resistance. Supply units were tasked not just with rice and ammunition, but with the herbs, the star anise, the cinnamon, the charred ginger that made a pot of broth taste like home rather than survival rations. The herb supply, some supply officers noted later, was nearly as carefully managed as the rifle ammunition supply. Some historians of the Indochina conflict argue that French commanders fundamentally misunderstood the nature of what they were fighting, that they saw a military insurgency when they were actually confronting a civilization that had spent 1,000 years turning scarcity into cuisine and cuisine into identity. You cannot bomb a people into submission when their deepest sense of self fits in a bowl. And then came the division, and the bowl moved south. Nguyen Tuan understood this. The great Vietnamese essayist and food writer understood that pho was not merely a dish but a document, a written record, in broth and bone, of everything Vietnam had survived. He understood why it was the perfect symbol. Everyone ate it, everyone could afford it, and the knowledge of how to make it lived, not in cookbooks or restaurants, but in the hands of women who had learned from their mothers and would teach their daughters. On the 10th of October 1954, the day the Viet Minh formally took control of Hanoi after the French withdrawal, street vendors were back at their posts before the last French convoy had cleared the city. They had been cooking through the night. Nguyen Tuan walked through the city that morning. He stopped at a kwan. He sat down at a low table on a plastic stool. He ordered a bowl. The vendor set it in front of him. It was, Nguyen Tuan wrote later, almost absurdly ordinary. A bowl of broth, some noodles, a few slices of beef, a plate of fresh herbs on the side. But he also wrote that he sat there for a long time without eating, looking at it, because what he was looking at was not a bowl of soup. It was proof that something had survived. That a colonial administration that had taxed salt, monopolized alcohol, and tried to remake Vietnamese culture in a French image had failed to touch the thing that mattered most. The recipe still existed, the vendors still knew it, the herbs were still available, the bones had been simmering since the night before. In the weeks that followed, as nearly 1 million northerners moved south, they brought their pho knowledge with them. Saigon's pho culture transformed almost overnight. Northern vendors, adapting to southern ingredients and southern tastes, began adding fresh bean sprouts, hoisin sauce, and chili paste condiments absent from the austere northern original. A new southern variant emerged. The two versions diverged, the way languages diverge when communities separate, carrying the memory of a shared origin even as they become something new. Pho did not end the war, or the division, or the decades of conflict that followed, but it survived everything that came after. Every regime, every invasion, every bombing campaign, every embargo, all because of pho. And then, almost anticlimactically, pho stopped being a secret. The fall of Saigon in 1975 sent another wave of Vietnamese refugees outward, this time across the Pacific, into France, into Australia, into Canada, into the United States. These were not economic migrants choosing a destination. They were people who left with what they could carry, which in many cases was almost nothing. What they could not leave behind was the knowledge. The first Vietnamese restaurants in California, Texas, and the American South opened in the late 1970s and early 1980s, often in storefronts that had been hardware stores or laundromats, furnished with plastic chairs and fluorescent lights and a menu that was 3 items long. Pho was always one of them. A bowl that had cost the equivalent of a few cents in Saigon now sold for $3 in a strip mall in Garden Grove, California. By 2000, the same bowl cost $8. By 2015, in a trendy restaurant with exposed brick and a cocktail menu, it cost $18. Today, the global pho restaurant industry generates an estimated $10 billion annually. Instant pho products are manufactured in factories in Vietnam, Thailand, and Malaysia at a scale that would have been incomprehensible to a Nam Dinh street vendor in 1925. The price of the herbs, the spices, and the noodles collapsed as industrial agriculture and global supply chains made them universally available. Star anise that once traveled 3 weeks by river junk from Guangxi now arrives at a restaurant kitchen in Memphis in a FedEx package, ordered on a phone, delivered overnight. Something was preserved in that efficiency, and something was lost. Every pho cook who learned from their grandmother, who knows that the ginger must be charred until it is almost burnt, who understands that the broth is not done until it is translucent, carries something that no supply chain can ship. Most of them are still cooking, and there is something both wonderful and strange about that. For over a century, pho shaped the daily life of a nation. It determined which neighborhoods prospered and which ones faded. It decided which communities maintained cultural cohesion through displacement and which ones scattered. People were taxed around it, fought over it, and carried it across oceans to reclaim their right to eat it. Colonial administrators tried to remake it. Military campaigns tried to starve it out. Embargo tried to cut off its ingredients. Refugees smuggled the recipe in their memories across a Pacific Ocean. The French Empire felt permanent. The American military presence in Vietnam felt permanent. The idea that pho would remain a regional secret known only to a few million people in a small country in Southeast Asia felt permanent. None of it was. You can see this pattern repeating with other things we think of as fixed. Data is the resource today that salt was 300 years ago, concentrated in a few hands, essential to nearly every transaction, generating enormous political power for whoever controls it. But technology is already changing the equation. Just as industrialization changed it for salt, just as displacement changed it for pho, one day, probably sooner than most people expect, the concentration of data might follow the same path. The things that feel like permanent power rarely are. Pho did not stop mattering because it became less remarkable. The human body needs the same collagen, the same warmth, the same specific combination of spice and salt and herb that a Hanoi worker needed in 1920 on a cold January morning before a long day of labor. What changed was access. So, the next time you sit down in front of a bowl, the steam coming off it, the broth clear and amber in the light, the noodles soft beneath the surface, the fresh basil, and the lime wedge on the side, waiting for you to decide how you want it, take a second to think about what you are looking at. You are looking at a colonial byproduct that became a national symbol, a refugee's memory that became a global industry. A grandmother's recipe that survived 2 empires, a partition, a war, and an ocean crossing. A pot that started simmering in the slaughterhouse districts of Hanoi before your grandparents were born and has not stopped since. All of that in a bowl. That dissolves on your tongue. If you found this surprising, hit that subscribe button and leave a comment telling us which part of Fayo's history caught you off guard the most. We have plenty more stories like this one coming, so make sure you do not miss them.